Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar on Drupal. This is our second webinar on content management system this month. As you might know that August is our web management month, so we have been running a few webinars, and last week we did a webinar on WordPress, and today we're doing Drupal, and next Wednesday we're going to do Joomla as our last content management system review. Today's presenter is Chris Ward. He's an expert in open source soft tools, so he will take you through Drupal, and if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them in the question box, and we will address them one by one a bit later on throughout the webinar. And I think that's basically all I need to say, and I'll pass it on to Chris now to start his presentation. Chris, are you there? Yep.
Hello. Yep. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to do a few slides as an overview of what Drupal is first, and then I'm going to do a demonstration through some basics, and then we'll have time for questions. I don't intend this to be technical, but I will introduce a few terms, but they will be explained primarily because whenever you use open source software, and I'll explain what that means, you will hear these terms, so it just pays to at least be aware of them. So let's get started. I'm just going to, okay. So what is Drupal? Firstly, it has a very friendly looking icon. It's a content management system, often shortened to CMS. WordPress is kind of a content management system. Joomla, as you will discover next week, definitely is. Joomla and Drupal are probably the two kind of most established ones in this development framework, which just implies you can do a lot more with it. It's used for a lot of complex sites as well as basic ones. So some people say it's a bit more than just managing a content, but I would probably say it's all of the above. It can just be a basic content management system, but it can also be something a lot more complex. And what does content management system mean? Well, content can be pretty much anything, and we manage it. We give it publishing styles, we give it publishing times, we give people privileges to create and edit that content and delete it and to view it, etc., etc. And we'll look at some of the details of that as we do a walkthrough. So Drupal is fully free and open source. This is free in both senses of the word. WordPress and Joomla both have a mixture of free and paid components, whereas Drupal is all completely free. You won't find any paid extensions and free extensions. Everything is free, as in cash free. But of course, employing experts to help you run a site is a different ballgame. But all the components theoretically are cash free. And open source, this is a term that is becoming more and more popular. It's not a new one, but it's becoming more noticed and recognized. This basically means that Drupal and a lot of the contributions to Drupal are created, curated, and managed by a community. Sometimes a community of people who use it, sometimes more in-depth developers, but likewise not just developers, designers, experts with user experience, expertise, helping the community realize areas of Drupal that don't quite make sense to people, etc., etc. So it's a community-created project is basically what open source means. It also means you can take any of the code, change it, and as long as you mention that it derived from Drupal in the first place, you can do that. So it's free to distribute and do what you like with, basically. And the final point is extremely flexible and extensible. I'm going to show you a walkthrough through a very completely out-of-the-box installation of Drupal. And out of the box, it can look fairly dull, to be fair. but you can add a lot to it. There's a lot of modules and styles you can add to extend Drupal, and I will talk about a few of those later, but it's just sort of something to bear in mind. There's a cliche within the Drupal community in that there's probably a module for that, basically implying if there's something you want to do that you can't find how to do straight away, someone has probably written an extension that will accomplish it for you, and if not, well, you can probably find someone to write one for you, but that's a whole different conversation. So who is using Drupal? I tried to make some lists of semi-relevant local and international users of it. So locally we have Australian Conservation Foundation down in Melbourne are using it. The State Library of Victoria are using it. New South Wales Government connecting up themselves, I do believe. Greens Party of Australia and New Zealand, I think. Fred Hollows Foundation are also using it. Globally, some of the big ones, they're more entertainment-based, the top ones there. MTV UK, Sony BMG. Sony BMG do some actually quite interesting things with their installation of Drupal. The White House, probably Obama was responsible for giving Drupal the name it now has because he took that decision to use it for the White House website. Well, not him personally, but someone in his team. The Economist in the UK, British Medical Journal, DirectGov, another UK government website. So it's fairly popular in the non-profit government sector. That's not to say you can't do commerce sites, but it just has grown in popularity in that sector, predominantly thanks to the White House. But you can see some good local and international examples there. Okay. I'm just going to introduce you to a few concepts and explain them here. So the image on the left, the diagram on the left, indicates some of Drupal's terminology. So I'm going to start from the bottom, number 1, so data, content, in other words. And Drupal's terms for that is nodes. You will encounter that word quite a lot, so it's worth mentioning it there. Basically, items of content, be they blog posts, articles, stories, about us pages, store products, etc., etc. They're all nodes. Then we have modules, which, as I've already mentioned, are extensions to Drupal functionality. Blocks and menus, number 3 on that diagram, can be considered structure. So menus, I guess everyone probably understands what a menu is, menus of where items exist in the structure of the site. Blocks are defined areas, so left-hand panels, right-hand panels, top panels, bottom panels, etc., etc. User permissions is what we let people do, and Drupal is very good at its user permissions, and we will have a look at a little bit of that later. And then finally, the template. This is what makes things look the way they are, whether your color scheme be blue, green, you use particular fonts, you have particular styles that you use in-house. That's where the template comes to play. And I would probably say, looking at number 4, some of the big advantages using Drupal over something like WordPress and Joomla is its permission system. It's very thorough. You can set permissions and what people are able to do to a very particular level, even down to letting people see and edit particular fields within a content item. It's very thorough. If you're very big into security and setting up a complex way of what people can and can't do on your website, Drupal excels at that. So that's one of its big advantages. Behind the scenes, this is probably the most complex bit of the whole thing, but just to introduce you to a few terms, everything runs on an operating system. Drupal will run on pretty much any operating system you like. It runs best on something called Linux, and even if you don't know what that means, basically most of the internet runs on Linux computers. So if you've never encountered it, you've used them without realizing. So an operating system, a web server, as it were. Adding on top of that is what actually serves the web pages, and there's a couple of terms there. Database. This is if you've ever used something like Access or FileMaker or even Excel spreadsheets. That's effectively your information. And because Drupal is a content management system, a dynamic content management system, you don't make HTML pages that are stuck statically and you have to change them to reflect updates. It pulls in information from a database and does things with that, and so the actual information and the way it is viewed are kept separately of each other. And that top level, PHP, which is a sort of a programming language, is what does that. It takes the information out of the database, performs some logic on it, and displays it. So there's just a few terms that you will encounter. So there's a very brief explanation of kind of what they mean in a very, very simplified terms. Okay. Okay, demo. Now, excuse me whilst I jump out of this and open up some browsers. Okay, I'm just also going to open up a quick note I made of what to walk through. So just give me a minute. Sorry. This is the problem with sharing your screen. You suddenly can. Okay. So, as I said initially, the basic items of content within Drupal are called nodes. So, I've created a few just random items of content to play around with and show you. So this one here is a news item. I'll open it up. And as I mentioned earlier, this is all using default Drupal look and feel. So if you install Drupal for the first time, this is kind of how it will look, this sort of blue look to things. But there's a lot of other ways it can look. This isn't set in stone. So you can see here we have a very simple item. It has a title, August News. We have submitted by information, submitted by the username and a date, a picture, some text, some tags. Tags or taxonomy are a very common way of organizing items of content into common categories. Think of it like an old school library organizing. You have books organized by botany or non-fiction, etc., etc. Do similar things with content on a website. And you can see here by default we're also allowed to have comments on that content, and that can be turned on and off. So let's have a look at an edit screen for that. And some of this should look fairly familiar to what we've just seen. So here we can see we have title. The red indicates that's compulsory. It's a fairly common site. Here you can see the tags, and that little circle over here indicates that that field will automatically pick from lists we have already. So if I just delete community here, see it spins there, and I start typing C, you can see community has already been entered as a tag, so it lets me pick from a list. So if I create a new one, then that doesn't exist yet, so it's not on that list. So this is a way of getting people to use standardized tags you may have if you want to organize your content in a particular way. Here is our body text. By default, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the WYSIWYG editor, or the what you see is what you get when you get a bar across the top of the text with things like bold, italics, underline, lists, etc. And they look a little and feel a little similar to how you would format, say, text in Word. Drupal by default doesn't have one of those, but it's very easy to turn on, and I will mention some later. But by default, it does some basic formatting. So for example, I've put a new paragraph there. At a point, maybe I'll make a change there. So it does some basic formatting, but if you want to do the more complex stuff, you will have to add something on to enable that. Here we have images. It's as simple as, maybe I'll do one. I'll remove that. I have to try and find a picture that isn't too large. I will do. So we choose a file, we click upload, you get a little spinner. And it also enables us to add some alternative text. This is for accessibility. Drupal is pretty good with accessibility, and Australian government actually has a requirement for all government sites to have accessibility considerations. And there is, I'm not 100% sure, but there is theoretically that could start applying to non-profits and NGOs as well. So pay to understand some of this stuff. This basically is saying for people who can't see or have poor vision, you have screen readers that actually read what is on the screen to you. And when there's an image, a screen reader has no idea what that image is. So you put in some alternative text that the screen reader will read out. Slight tangent from Drupal there, but just to understand what that is. And these boxes below are some of the more complex little things towards a bit of content. Some of them are fairly self-explanatory. So do we want to add it to a menu? It'll ask us what we want to call the menu item and which menu we want it to appear on. And I'm reticent to click this because it's one of the more, oh, actually, that's okay. So if we wanted to add it to a menu, I won't in this case. So I'll just untick that box. Revisioning is quite a useful feature in Drupal content. It actually lets you create revisions of content. So if you had something of an approval process, you can actually get people to create a different revision of content. You can look at that revision, and if you like it, say, yes, let's publish that. And if you don't like it, don't publish it, send it back to them to revise. So instead of creating one item of content that you update and then the original is lost, you can actually create, say, 5 versions of an item of content and pick and choose which one you want to then publish. URL alias. So this is predominantly aimed at search engines, Google, etc. If you see up the top here, by default, this item of content is called /node/1. If you remember our references to nodes earlier, that may imply, well, that's node, and it's the first one. But that makes no sense, really, to anybody else, and especially to search engines. They will look at that and think, what does that mean? So the URL alias lets us put in a more meaningful alias. So I'll type one in, and it'll look clearer. And it gives you some descriptive text there. So I might type in August news, for example. Comments or not, it's a news item, so I think we do. Authoring information, who is the author? There's only one person, one user defined on this website, so but we could theoretically override that there. If you want to make it look like an item of content is really written by your CEO and it isn't, you could change it to their name here. And likewise, a date. If you wanted to update some content, make it look like it was written yesterday when it was actually written a year ago, you could just change the date. And again, publishing options. Published, is it actually published or not? Promoted to the front page, is it automatically on the front page or is it just somewhere else on the website? And sticky, basically when we have lists of content, sticky means it's always on the top. That's what that means. So let's save that. And you can also see down the bottom here we can do previews of our changes and also delete. Let's just save it for now. We haven't made any massive changes.
Chris, we have a few questions already in line at the moment.
Firstly, you can see our image. Okay.
Should we go through them
Okay.
now, or should we wait until
I'm nearly finished on this section.
Okay, sure. I'll wait until you finish, and then we'll go through the questions.
I'm nearly finished on this section, so yeah. So you can see here our image has changed. You can see that paragraph break isn't there anymore. We've added a comment. We've added a tag. And just to prove that point, you can see here it doesn't say Node 1 anymore. It says August News. So, okay. Questions up to now?
Right, we have quite a few. First of all, the question from Shane.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry, I think there's a bit of a lag between me and you. So, is publishing times a default setting as like in Joomla?
Yeah, by default it will pick the current date and time, but that's just if you want to change it. The best example is if you're trying to update an older item of content and you want to make it look like it's recent. That could be one example. But by default it picks the current date and time.
A second question from Charles Foster. What minimum version of PHP is required?
Off the top of my head, I would say probably 5 point something. But if you double checked the requirements page on the Drupal website, I can probably find that out exactly now. But it would be 5 something. Most of these to keep up to date with changes now, annoyingly, but anyway. That will tell you exactly, but I would hesitate to guess at 5 point something. Yeah.
Great.
I'll leave it at that.
We've got a question from Karen. Would you use user permissions to create password protected such as member areas of a website? And within these areas, how do you set up searches for the info or nodes? Can you do searches within the protected areas?
Okay, I will touch upon permissions a bit later. But in case we run out of time or something like that, I will say yes, you could. And say, for example, if you create, say, intranet content item and you make it so that only people with a login can see it, then likewise, if someone who doesn't have a login searches, it won't come up in the search results. So you can theoretically quite easily make a whole bunch of content that can be hidden from view of what is called anonymous users, users who don't have a login. So I can actually show you a little bit of how we do that a bit later, but the quick answer is yes.
The question that Shane raised earlier about publishing time, apparently he meant stop publishing at a particular date or time. Is that possible?
Okay. Yes, with an additional module called scheduler. So yes, but with an additional module.
Another question from James. With comments, is there a way to add some sort of filter or other way to stop Viagra upon weight loss spam appearing?
Yes. Drupal has a few anti-spam modules to choose from. There's Capture, which is the standard weird-looking graphic that you've probably seen a lot of places. There's also one called Mollom, M-O-L-L-O-M, which is actually created by the creator of Drupal, so most would say it's the best option. And they all work in similar ways in that you can pick which forms you want to add that to. You might want to add it to all forms. You may only want to add it to comment forms. You can set the level of complexity, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, but again, and I'll probably give this answer a lot, with an additional module.
Another, Caitlin is asking what version you are using for this demo because the UI is different to the version that she uses.
Yep, this is Drupal 7, which is the latest current. A lot of sites are still using Drupal 6, which they do have some significant differences visually and also in terms of the program behind the scenes. Upgrading from one to the other isn't too hard. And 6 months ago, I wouldn't have recommended anyone uses Drupal 7, but these days it's pretty stable now. Pretty much any of the modules you would be using on Drupal 6 and now available in Drupal 7, and it makes some very significant improvements. So I would recommend you look into upgrading at some point, but this demo is in Drupal 7.
Actually answered another question by Eliza about how easy it is to upgrade from Drupal 6 to 7, so you've practically answered that. That's correct. I've got another question on how old is the revision?
It depends.
Yep, sorry.
No, that's all right, don't worry.
Shane was asking how old is the revision feature? Is it a default feature or must it be turned on?
Revision is by default. I can't quite remember if it used to be. Drupal 7 made a lot of things that people used to install optionally in Drupal 6. They've been moved into the core, the what comes out the box straight away. But it's a default feature now. There's certain other modules that extend it. For example, Workbench, which actually gives you gives each user, say, an approval queue of content that they need to look at, which we've used for a lot of clients. So revisioning itself is default, but making it maybe more user-friendly and more helpful, there's other modules that do that.
Another question is you mentioned about the promote to front page option. Is that only useful if you have a newsfeed style function on your home page?
Sort of. Yes and no. The one thing that I will hopefully have time to touch on is by default the way Drupal lays out content is fairly limited, as you may have seen and as that question possibly alludes to. But there are, again, some very good modules that let you then change your layouts and the way content is displayed fairly easily and into some fairly complex layouts. Like the world is your oyster in terms of how you want to lay Drupal content out with those extra modules. But that said, you can then use that promote to front page as a flag to do whatever you like. So you could, for example, change it so everything that's checked promote to front page is actually put in a block on the left-hand side instead of it all being as it is on this demo site. So it's a slightly open answer to the question, but by default, yes, it's pretty much just like a news site, but with some extensions, you could do all sorts of things with it.
Can comments be moderated?
Yes, definitely. By default, you can make comments, anyone can post a comment, or you can make it so that all comments have to be moderated and approved before they're made live. And that's a fairly simple configuration option just to change.
Caitlin's asking another question. How can you set Drupal to automatically populate the URL alias according to the menu or navigation that you have defined?
Okay. There is another very popular Drupal module called, I think, path alias, which lets you define predetermined patterns for that URL alias. It's not turned on this demo site, but it's very easy to turn on. You can, say, set the path based on a menu. You could have it set on dates, on the username of the person submitting. Again, the problem with Drupal, in some respects, it's not really a problem, is that there's so many modules that extend things in so many ways. Pretty much my answer to a lot of questions will be there's a module that does it. So, so yes, you can with, I think, path alias.
All right, we might move on now, and we'll have a few more questions a bit later on. So we'll just move along. Back to you, Chris.
Sure. I might cut a few. Okay. I'm going to just go a little bit more in depth into content. So far we've looked at just editing and creating some basic content. So Drupal defines content types and also then fields within those content types. So what do we mean by content types? It's fairly arbitrary, really. You can define a content type to be anything you want that makes sense to you, really. So in the default installation, you get a basic page. And as it says in the descriptive text under the name there, use basic pages for your static content, such as an About Us page. So pages that don't change very much, pages that you probably don't want to open up to comments, etc., etc. Then above that, you can see articles. Use articles for time-sensitive content like news, press releases, or blog posts. Now, those two may be more than enough for many people, but you might want to create different ones just to sort of basically organize your content. You might want to create products. You might want to create board meeting minutes. You might want to create those intranet pages we alluded to earlier, so you can get a bit more finesse over how those items of content are then controlled. Say, for example, only giving logged in users privileges to view particular content items, only giving certain users privileges to comment on certain content items, giving certain content items a different look from others, etc., etc. So if you're making a simple site, those two inbuilt ones might be enough. But if you want to do a bit more complexity, then you might want to create more. Or yeah, it's pretty much up to you, really. So I won't actually go through adding a content type, but I'm going to show you how to add fields instead. Let's wait for it to load. So this fields is one of the sort of Drupal features that I consider a real standout, and enables you to create some really flexible and complex content types if you want to. So by default, you can see we have a title. We can't change anything about that. Everything has to have a title. You can see there we have tags, and the field type is called a term reference. Those taxonomy terms, those tags, those keywords, those ways of organizing content. A body is the main body of the text, and you can see there we have an image field. Those are the predefined ones, but we could actually edit and delete all of those if we wanted to. And if we really want, it wouldn't be much use to anybody, but we could do it. And by default, you can see down the bottom here, we can add a bunch of different fields. And some of these may make sense, some of them may not, but just to illustrate some sort of context and some cases where you might want to use some of these, you could add here numbers, file uploads, things like attachments, PDFs, flyers, things like that, extra images, lists that people have to pick from when creating content, more text fields, decimal points might start to imply some kind of cost or value to items of content. And these could be private and public fields. So they might be fields that you let the public see, but they might be fields that only you and your website team see. So for example, say for example, an additional field telling you who last made, actually that's not a good example, a priority maybe a priority on an item of content for people to go and edit, and then you could organize your content behind the scenes around that. I don't know, maybe that's not another good example either, but just to illustrate that you can have fields that are visible to everybody and hidden from people as well. And the widget there, I have to actually select something. So the widget is, oops, no, not that one. Just want to find something that actually has a way of displaying that when you edit the content. So if we had a list of text, it could be a select list, like a drop-down list, as you can see here, or checkboxes and radio buttons. And when you add modules to Drupal, it will add more options to these. For example, dates, quantities. So you might have, you might want to add fields that represent weight, size, things like that. Again, that alludes to goods for e-commerce. a size and a dimensions of something. Extra formatters for things like YouTube videos, Flickr photos, etc., etc. The field feature in Drupal 8, there's lots of things you can do with it. And this is a very much tip of the iceberg, but just to give you an idea. And equally, you can even just manage the way those fields are displayed. So here's where you could potentially show and hide fields. So you can see here, no field is hidden. So if you wanted to have fields that were only seen by an internal team, internal. You can see here we've got style. There's a bunch of predefined image styles, and we could change those, change the sizing, change if they get cropped or not, etc., etc. And for example, here on the format of the body text as well, etc., etc. So there's a lot of control over how you edit and display content. And this is why some people will say, oh, Drupal has a steep learning curve. And in some ways it does, because it offers you so much flexibility that getting your head around that flexibility can take some time. But it can mean that a site can go pretty much in any direction you want. So, yeah. And just to show you where an overarching view of all that content is, so if we go up to content, we can see here, we can this is where we can manage our backlog, our list of content, and we can filter it, so we can have a look for content that's not been published yet, that's not been promoted to the front page, and vice versa, look for items of a certain content type, and then we can perform some bulk operations on all of these. So I could select everything and say, I want to unpublish everything for some particular reason. But yeah, so now everything has been unpublished. So if I went back to the home page now, I would see no content anywhere. Not terribly helpful for a site with only 2 items of content, but just to illustrate the point, and I'll publish it again now. And now it's published again, as you can see here. Okay. So I might go into, seeing as there was a few questions around permissions and what you can't do, I might touch on that a little bit. So the section in the Drupal 7 interface is people. So at the moment I've only got 1 user. Not everyone has to have a user account, of course. Just normal people dropping by your website to look at it, they don't have to have a user account to do anything. But then again, you could lock everything down, so only people with a user account. Just to be clear on that, not everyone has to have an account. So this just shows us our list of users, and you can see roles we have here, and some of the default ones. Well, there is only administrators at the moment, but I should jump into permissions. I'm just going to jump out of this quickly and look at roles first. So you can see here we have an anonymous user. That is someone who doesn't have an account or hasn't logged into their account anyway. Authenticated user, someone who has logged into their account. An administrator. An administrator is an administrator. And we can add more here. We could add, say, for example, an editor who has extended permissions over creating and editing content, but can't change the site setup. We could have a writer who can create content, but can't decide when it's published, for example. So you could have a whole workflow going on there. And that is something to think about before setting up a site. Like, who are the roles within your organization? What do we want them to be able to do? It's good to have a think about that before diving into setting something up. And as you can see here, each role can have a particular permission. I'm going to jump back to the big grid. It's a little daunting, but just to give you an idea, so these checkboxes indicate what each role can do, and we have a bunch of predefined permissions. And as you add modules, more permissions will appear here, and each module will have a defined list of what the developer has thought should be a permission, but maybe you disagree and you want to change it. So you can see here an administrator administrator has a checkbox by pretty much everything. Authenticated users can do a few things. So, for example, in relation to comments here, an authenticated user, a user with a login account, so someone you hopefully trust, can post comments without approval, whereas someone who you've no idea who they are can only just look at comments. That answers a little bit some of the questions around comments earlier as well, and et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into all of these because it's fairly daunting to look at and introduces some starting to get complex concepts, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but just to give you an idea of that with what people can do on your website. And likewise with those fields we looked at earlier, we could set here an anonymous user can't see this particular field, maybe an address, for example. And even with items of content, we could say anyone can create a news item. We want to have a website where people can come and suggest items of news. So anyone can create a news item. Only an administrator can approve it, but anyone can create it. But not everyone can create an About Us page, for example. So you can define permissions per content type as well. Okay. Let's go into something a little less complex and have a look at the appearance of a Drupal site, the way it looks. So we're using a default theme at the moment. And Drupal, especially with Drupal 7, has got better with the way it looks and feels, but it certainly does lack maybe the variety of themes you can just download and install that something like WordPress has. But at the same time, I would personally feel a lot of those with WordPress look fairly similar. But that, of course, I'm a Drupal person, so I'm going to say something like that. But this is just some of the default ones we have, and there are many that are free to download. But creating your own, if you have someone with a reasonable amount of technical skills, is not too hard. You can get sort of starter kits that give you the basic structure, and you can move things around and add some color to that. Or you can take something that looks vaguely like a style you want to get and then change it. But that does involve knowing some HTML and some CSS. And anyone who doesn't know what those terms mean, well, probably don't dive into theme development. But it does require knowing some coding knowledge. So you can see here there's a few default ones that are given to us that we could turn on and off. Not terribly inspiring list, because this is just the default. Also want to introduce you to blocks. I'm going to turn on this regions thing and you'll see this will make it clearer. So you can see here in this theme, and it's defined by the theme, we have a set of areas on the page that are defined: a header, featured, main content, sidebars, footer, etc., where we can place things. And in this case, we can place blocks here. So sidebar first, for example. I'll exit this. Let's add a block to the first sidebar. So this is the default list of blocks. There can be a variety of things, and again, when you add modules, they will add additional blocks. So you can see at the moment in the first sidebar is a search form, the navigation menu, and a login box. What else can we add? Let's add who's new, just something that, actually I'm going to add who's online instead, because that'll at least have something in it, even if it's only me. So that's just disappeared from the list, and if we scroll up, you can now see it is inside sidebar first. We have to click save though, just to save that. If I just close this, for the page to refresh, so you can now see there's a new block there saying who's online. There's currently one user online. Not necessarily the most useful block in the world, but just a demonstration of how we can fairly easily arrange a page and move items around the page in those defined regions. And likewise with menus are also in There's a variety of default Drupal menus. The main menu, I'll show you that one, is this one here. So at the moment we only have the home added to the main menu, but I will add something to it. And as we saw earlier, when you create content items, you can add them to a menu from there as well. But I'm just going to add a link, just a random link, just to do something quickly. And this path can be to another website as well, if you want it to be. I'll just leave that all for now. I'm doing this presentation off of a Telstra 3G thing, that could be a bit slow at times. And now we could see when that refreshes, we now have, trust me, it is there when the page, there we go, we now have a new link that will take us to Google if I clicked it. Just to prove it to you, I'll let it go through its motions. There we go. Okay. And there's a few other menus as well. I'll just quickly show you the others. But management menu is for administrative tasks, so the one we're seeing at the top here. Navigation is things like user items, how they can log in, how they can log out, shortcuts for them to create content, things like that. And the user menu is links to their account, and you can add more things to that. But just to show you the sort of structural stuff is all grouped under structure. Blocks where we can put items and little lists and other menu items, other bits of content, etc., etc. Go into blocks, and we can move them around the page. And menus is our menu structure. Okay. I'm just going to show you a couple of other quick administration items just to show you the potential, and then quickly mention a few modules you might find helpful. But I'm just going to go to configurations first. It is also worth pointing, whilst I'm up here, reports. You get reports on things like errors, popular pages, common searches people perform. By default, there's a few reports there that you could find helpful. But just to give a quick idea of some of the other options here, site information, as you can see there, is where you change the site name, the default email address, a slogan, things like that. Image styles is where I was talking earlier about those predefined sizes of images that are rendered. Show you it's fairly easy here. So large, for example, we could go in here, quite easily change the size, add things like cropping, items like that. I think that the one down the bottom is also what I wanted to show. Drupal is fairly good at catering for regional differences, be that different languages, but also more relevant to, say, Australia, time formats, currency formats, time zone, things like that, which quite often can be very American-centric, but can make a difference to people visiting your site if all the dates are around the American way, etc., things like that. Okay, I might just mention, I'll increase the font size on this. It's probably a very quick way of showing you. So here's a list of other modules I recommend if you wanted to play around with Drupal, you had a look at. Views is almost any experienced Drupal developer's second thing they do after installing Drupal is install views. Views is, I'm going to try and explain it in simple terms, but in my mind it's the second reason why I would recommend Drupal to anyone over any other content management system. It basically lets you take your content or your users or all sorts of information on your website and visualize it in many different ways. It's like a database tool. It's like an Excel spreadsheet. It's all that, but also you can change the way it looks too. It's hard to explain without getting too complex, but it's a way of taking your information and organizing it, visualizing it, displaying it in a different way with a relatively straightforward interface. And I'll leave it at that, probably. Panels is similar, but it lets you change the overall, instead of just items of content, the overall structure of a page, where fields go, where menus go, the layout of the page. The WYSIWYG is what I mentioned earlier, that visual editor that you can add to the text field, so you can do formatting to your text. And the admin or admin menu are just extra modules that may help your site administrators perform some regular tasks. So if there's a menu item that you use a lot, but you can't remember where it is, you can add it to a shortcut menu so you can just access things you do a lot, basically. And I might wrap up for some final questions on just talking about where to go for help, where to go from here, basically. Sydney and Melbourne both have pretty good Drupal communities. Drupal mentoring in Melbourne is actually on tomorrow in the State Library, if you're in Melbourne, free, and has a meetup group every month. Sydney is the same. I'm not 100% sure of their schedule, but if you look it up, you'll find it. And there's always a wide variety of people willing to offer help to beginners to advanced users. And the forums on the Drupal website are fairly good as well, or you can drop me an email, of course, but I'm only one person, so I might take a while to get back to you. But so Sydney and Melbourne both have communities. I'm not sure about Adelaide, or Perth does too. Tasmania, I think, might have a small one. So Australia has a pretty good Drupal community. And just to indicate how valued the Australia community is, the conference that we've held every year, which is a gathering of everyone from around the country, this coming year, so for 2013, we've actually been upped. So we were previously just a community conference, and now we're being officially sanctioned by the organisers of Drupal. So they've actually recognised that the Australia-New Zealand community is significant, which is very nice. So it's nice to know that, you know, our community we have down here has been recognised as a significant one in the world. So it's good times for Drupal.
All right.
So any final questions?
Yes. I think Simon also mentioned that there is a community in Brisbane, so that's a good information.
Okay.
There are quite a number of last-minute questions. I'm not sure if some of them might have
Okay.
been answered. I'll just quickly go through them. Sajid is asking, does Drupal support Active Directory authentication and integration?
I would probably assume it can. I have never done that myself, but it has some modules for something called LDAP, which works in a similar way to Active Directory. So I would assume, I think there's a module called Bakery, spelt the way you'd expect, that might be worth looking at and might be able to answer that question better than I can, because I've never actually done that myself. But Drupal is pretty good at integrating with other services and systems, so I would probably say yes, but you might want to just do a little bit of research to double check that.
Great. James asking, where is the best place to get or download Drupal in the first place?
Okay, Drupal.org is your general good start point for anything Drupal related, but if you want to get started very quickly, there's actually the company that sort of funds Drupal in a roundabout kind of way, called Acquia, A-C-Q-U-I-A, has some installers you can actually download and handles all the PHP, MySQL stuff for you. So instead of having to download Drupal, download PHP, configure MySQL, etc., which can be complex if you just want to try the thing, Acquia's website, I think acquia.com, actually has some literally one-click installers you can download, run, and you get Drupal straight away, like an application in itself. So that's probably a good start point for anyone who's not familiar with those terms.
Simon also, there was a question earlier on about PHP requirements for Drupal. Simon
Yeah.
kindly listed the requirements, which I've already posted on the chat box. So if you had a look at that, so thanks Simon for that information. Question by Caitlin, can you search for content by date fields?
By default, the Drupal search is fairly simple in that it will search title and the body. But yet again, there are modules that add to that. So yes, and with that views module I mentioned, you can actually do some things with that around more advanced search as well. So again, yes, with additional modules.
Talking about module, Greg asked if there is a good mobile device module.
Sorry, I lost you there.
Greg was asking if there is a good mobile device module.
Okay. Yes, there are a few actually, depending on how you want to interact with the Drupal website. There are mobile optimized themes. Basically, if you do a search on the Drupal website for anything that is responsive, again, spelt the way you would expect, that will work on most mobile devices. But you can also do more complex things. So you could, for example, have an iPhone app that talks to your Drupal website, but it's not actually the website. So Drupal is pretty good with mobile integration, and depending on the level you want to use, has modules and themes available. So yes, definitely.
Tasha was asking if you have a specific template that you're using, but it doesn't allow you certain blocks. If I change the template, will it move over the edited content and HTML of which we've changed to add our logo and coloring? Does that make sense?
Not quite. I don't completely understand the question. You can define your own areas for blocks, yes, but you will need to do a little bit of coding to get that to work. Possibly what you might mean is there's a module called, I think, Node in a Block, where you could have an item of content and make it appear in a block. Maybe that was what the question was. So maybe, depending on what the question was.
Okay, Karen was asking, can you use Drupal for a section of a website only, as like WordPress obviously could do it, so she's asking whether Drupal can do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could pretty much do that with any kind of content management system. It then becomes very much dependent on how you set up your web server, and unfortunately there's no way of answering this question without talking about a web server, because it will pretty much depend on how you set that up and how you set paths on your website and where they should go. So yes, definitely, but it will require a bit of getting someone who knows how to administer a web server to get that to go to the right place. But yes, you could.
Keith is asking, are there free sites where you can use Drupal to host your website, such as Google Sites?
No. Actually, yes and no. Not Google Sites. Google Sites will not handle anything as complex as Drupal. They tend to be fairly simple, more plain HTML pages. But Acquia, the company I mentioned earlier, has a sort of a WordPress.com equivalent where you can set up a free with a few features Drupal site easily and visually. So they do something like that, but it's not quite the same. I mean, hosting is relatively cheap. Drupal needs reasonable resources if you're going to be having a busy website. If you just want to make a simple website for a small organization or for yourself, you can just get some fairly basic, cheap hosting, like under $10 a month, and it will work okay. If you want to do something bigger, then you will need to spend more money. But yeah, Acquia.com again, I think it's called Drupal Gardens, is sort of equivalent to WordPress.com. So it's taking Drupal and letting you just sort of make sites quickly and easily. without realizing what you're doing. So there's a couple of options there.
Just two final questions. I don't know if you've touched on this, but Caitlin was asking if you can touch on the difference between blocks and panels.
Okay, they're fairly similar. Blocks is the default way of arranging certain items around the page, and for a couple of technical reasons, a lot of people prefer panels, and for reasons I won't go into because it involves explaining a lot of other things, but a lot of hardcore Drupal developers don't use blocks for a reason. And panels solves that problem. But it also lets you, so for example, blocks tend to have, as you saw, the areas. So you have a left sidebar, a right sidebar, a bit in the middle where your content goes, and you can sort of move things around that kind of area. But say, for example, inside your content area, you wanted to have 2 columns. Well, that is where panels can come in. I'll actually show you a very quick, I'll show you, this is example of a
I might also quickly mention that we are recording this webinar, so I understand that this is slightly over time. So
just wait for this page to. Okay. It'll take 2 seconds when this page, these menus, that's blocks. That's me just putting some menu items into the left-hand side. The bit in the middle, oh, this is a pain. I'm doing this on a mobile thing. Here we go. So I've got an image here in a column and then the content in the column on the right-hand side. That was done with panels. So I've sort of got columns within columns. And that is where panels comes into play. So I don't know if that helped explain or not, but that's an example.
I was saying that we are recording this webinar, so I will make it available. I will send you guys the link to the webinar afterwards once it's uploaded, so you can catch up on any questions if you need to go. That's basically the last question that we had. Caitlin did mention that she saw some other items that we didn't get time to touch on, such as self-hosting in particular. Yeah. Do you think you'll be able to follow up with some information for webinar attendees on self-hosting? I'm not exactly sure in what format, but
yeah, that was sort of partially answered that question, but it was just recommendations on hosting really, because as I say, if you've got a busy website, Drupal needs a little bit of resources and just some recommendations of some minimum resources you might need and where to look, basically. So that's an easy thing to link to, yeah.
And just a final note from Shane O'Brien. Apparently Adelaide has a tech meet on the 23rd of August on Grenfell Street, level 1, 115 Grenfell Street, so a bit of a promotion there. That's basically all the questions that we have. So I just want to take this time to thank Chris for facilitating. I think it's been great. There were a lot of questions and involvement. And thank you everyone for joining. Following on from the webinar, I will be sending you an evaluation form, a link to the online evaluation. If you can please take a short time to fill that out, it would be great so that we know how well received this has been. It's a very short survey, so it won't take very long. Other than that, I will send you the link to the recording in the next few hours, and that's basically all. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope to see you again at the webinar next week on Joomla. Thank you.